We all expected something would come, some help here. You'd hear aeroplanes, something would be about, but nothing came.
She was trying to help a little 3-year-old child into one of the lifeboats and failed to get the little child into the lifeboat and went down herself during that attempt.
People never thought this could happen. They built the Victoria thinking it was suitable for all types of weather.
On January the 31st, 1953, a huge storm began forming in the North Atlantic. As it moved southwards, heavy rain and extreme winds battered the British Isles. Gusts of more than 120 miles per hour were recorded. In less than 24 hours, some 300 people died after huge parts of the south of England were flooded. And off the Irish coast, the first ever modern ferry disaster took place.
I'm Billy McAllister. I was a galley boy aboard the Princess Victoria. I get up at 6:30 and we were going up to the galley, but I never thought there was anything going to happen, because just bad weather. It was really bad weather. The boat was hitting against the quay before she left, but it was only high tide, and that's what usually does that at high tide. But I never thought anything would happen,
My name is John McKnight, and I was the chief cook on the Princess Victoria. I certainly have many thoughts about all the crew members, all the young men. I've had 60 years of life. Their lives were cut off like that. It was a terrible tragedy.
I'm Karen Atkinson, and I've been talking to some of the last of the 44 survivors and the relatives of the 133 people lost in the Princess Victoria disaster.
The Princess Victoria that was on the Larne Stranraer route was the fourth ship to bear that name. She was a revolutionary new design built by Denny's on the Clyde. British Transport were the owners of the ship. And she was a roll-on, roll-off ferry that you could drive cars on through the stern, onto the car deck and bring them back out again. She came into service round about 1946.
Author Stephen Cameron has done extensive research on the ferry tragedy.
There have been so many things that happened previously with the Princess Victoria, that alarm bells should have been ringing, that all came together at this day. In 1949, she got hit with a terrible storm and there was milk tankers on board. And one of these tankers broke free from its chassis and started to roll around the car deck. The ship took a list on and it took it round about 40 minutes to come back onto an even keel. On November 1951, as she was coming past the Maidens, she got hit by a terrible storm and took on a list of about 15 or 20 degrees. And had this all been thought about, and had they decided that we need to do something about this, then the Princess Victoria may still be sailing.
On a January morning, when the Princess left the harbour at Stranraer, it was 7:45. Every man on board alive, when with her agency she went to on.
Ernest Jardine was a coast guard in Portpatrick in 1953.
The conditions on that day were absolutely appalling. It wasn't a gale force, it was storm or hurricane, it was dreadful weather. And the sea and the spume and all the rest of it round that ship as it was going down Loch Ryan from Stranraer would be pretty horrendous.
Jim Ferguson was 18 years old in 1953 and a student in Glasgow. His father, Captain James Ferguson, had been in charge of the Larne Stranraer ferry for many years.
The weather forecast talked about severe gales, and then about 3/4 of an hour later it had reduced to gales, and then another 3/4 of an hour later it reduced to strong winds. Now, any seaman worth his salt will go out in weather that's designated strong winds. Besides which, they'd been out in rough stuff before. As I said, the difference this time being that the gates buckled with a wave and water started to pour in.
Jack Hunter is a retired Stranraer school teacher who has written about the tragedy.
We're now right down in the seafront of Stranraer. We're walking along the promenade right beside the beach, about midway between the railway pier and the west end of the west side of the loch.
And we can see the pier where the Princess Victoria would have left from on that day?
It's much modified now for the modern ferries, but that is the same pier, and the grey building is the railway building, is the station where the boat train arrived and from where it departed. So that over there was where the Victoria started on her last fatal voyage.
On board the ship, crew members prepared for sea that morning. Larne man John McKnight, now 94 and living in his hometown, was in the kitchen.
I started work at 5:30 in the morning, and the train from London came in at 6 o'clock, and everything had to be prepared and ready to serve breakfast. We served that and eventually sailed at some time around about 7:30 or 20 to 8. We proceeded up Loch Ryan, and as we went up Loch Ryan, we discovered that it was a severe gale blowing.
Normally she would proceed quite quickly up the loch. But that day, you see, with a northwesterly gale, the loch faces almost northwest, and so the gale was coming almost straight down the loch, and so she made very slow going. She took 3/4 of an hour to reach the mouth of the loch, which was probably nearly double what it normally would have taken her.
Sadly, the Achilles heel of the Princess Victoria was at the stern where you would drive on.
Stephen Cameron again.
There was a set of gates, 5'6" high, that would fold over and close, were held in place by a drawbolt and 2 metal stays. But above those gates, you could be standing in a well where you could see the sky above you, and if you were taller than 5'6", you could see over the doors and see the sea behind you.
Businessman Billy Bird was a regular on the ferry.
When we passed Corswell Point, you get out more or less into the open sea. And it was rough.
Jack Hunter says that it was at this point that Captain Ferguson appears to have tried to turn back to Stranraer.
Perhaps because out of the shelter of the loch he discovered that the sea was much worse. Perhaps because the change of direction meant the ship was having more difficulty. But for one reason or another, it looks as if he decided to turn back and head for Loch Ryan. And it was then that the ship had its calamitous encounter with the large wave which stove in the stern doors.
Jim Blair, a surviving crew member from Larne who died in 1992, was able to recall that moment clearly when he spoke to the BBC almost 40 years after the event.
All of a sudden there was a thud, and she leapt in the air. The bow came right out the water. We come down with the thud, and I could hear this big crash. And this was, she must have took about 200 ton right up the car deck with the one swipe.
Albert Dickey was a young soldier on leave, travelling home from Germany. He also felt the impact of the mountainous wave.
Just after the Greater Loch Ryan, whether it was turning into the wind or what, there was one merciful thud. The whole ship shook. She rocked and she heaved.
With his stern doors irreparably broken, what were Captain Ferguson's choices? Stephen Cameron again.
Really, whenever the ship was overcome by the waves, Ferguson was in a real dilemma. There was several things he could do. Try and reverse the ship back into Loch Ryan. But to do that, he had to send crew forward to release the bow rudder so that he could steer to come backwards.
I watched them out of the window, working at it. But having tried that a number of times, I found that they just couldn't do it and they gave it up. It was too rough. They couldn't manage it.
Unable to release the bow rudder, the captain's options were now limited.
It was also thought that he was attempting to try and keep to the Scottish coast as close as he could and go north as far as he could before then turning west and heading for a short run across the North Channel into Northern Ireland.
People from all social classes were on the Princess Victoria, including the Northern Ireland Deputy Prime Minister Maynard Sinclair and the North Down MP Sir Walter Smiles. Short Brothers workers from the company's Scottish base were going home for the weekend, and families with young children were travelling too. From the moment the stern doors were breached, all 127 passengers and 49 crew were locked in a terrible and increasingly impossible struggle for survival.
Now, when she took that heavy thud, She shipped all the furniture, which was on the port side, right down across the smoke room. I was flung across the table into the corner. Maynard Sinclair was upside down in his chair, and there was another old gentleman, Sir Walter Smiles. He was in his hands and knees looking for his glasses. And all the tables were smashed. Everything was absolutely terrible.
Apart from the cold, the bitter cold, the weather was so bad that most of the passengers were being sick. The smell of vomit accelerated everybody else's attitude. The toilets in the cross passage between the lounge and the dining room were overflowing, washing down this passageway as this got worse.
A surviving crew member speaking the day after the sinking in 1953 described the struggle below decks.
Our boatswain called all his men available, but to go down into the car deck and try and close the cargo doors. And the first time we succeeded and got them secured, and then the next time another big wave hit us and burst them open again. So we tried for another time, but it was impossible for this time. There was about maybe 20 to 30 tons of water in the car deck.
Lieutenant Commander John Stanford was travelling on the Princess Victoria to join his own ship in Derry. 40 years later, he recalled to the BBC how he and another friend went down to the car deck to see what the problem was for themselves.
Stern doors were quite severely buckled, and despite the ship's staff, under the boatswain, I believe, working very, very hard to try and shut them or to wedge them shut, there was quite considerable gaps in the doors and seas were still coming in.
They tried desperately to help.
My colleague and I asked the nearest man, is there anything we can do to help? And he referred us to the boatswain, who asked us if we would bring some wooden shores across, huge pieces of sort of 8x8 timber, which he was trying to wedge against the ring bolts in the deck and against the door.
But as the rolling sea poured through the broken stern doors, there was nowhere for it to escape. Stephen Cameron.
The scuppers that were on the car deck were there to drain any water away from the car deck quickly. And the problem with these scuppers was that they weren't that big. A cigarette packet could lodge in them and could actually block them.
We tried to clear the scuppers, but it was impossible because all the water, there was some of the cargo blocking the scuppers, you see, and couldn't get through.
As the catastrophe unfolded on the car deck, 16-year-old Billy McAllister, who still lives in his native Larne, remembers what he saw.
She just got hit, you know, and it was about half an hour, and it says that the doors he busted open, you know, down below, and they were trying to get them closed. We went over and looked over the side, a lot of water getting in, you know.
Captain Ferguson, I remember his words. I remember that very, very clearly. Our ship's come through a crisis. The crew will issue with life jackets.
Steward Jim Blair.
I came back down and I met the stewardess, Miss Close, and Miss Baxter, two of them. And Minnie, as we called her, was in the state because there was two children just as he came in off the boat deck. And Minnie says, Jim, will you give us a hand to put these jackets on these two youngsters? She says they're going mad. So there's another chap they call Jim McCowan, and I went in and I tied the jackets round these two kids. And honestly, I could see them. I could see them. And eventually we got them on anyhow.
At 9:46, Princess Victoria sent its first urgency message. It was received by the Coast Guard in Portpatrick.
We took this message and never believed for a moment it would develop into anything worse. However, about an hour later, the XXX became SOS, a distress message, which is top urgency. And, of course, from then on, it was very serious.
We've arrived at Stranraer Museum in the centre of town, where a small exhibition commemorates the sinking of the Princess Victoria, and the centrepiece of it is the George Cross that was awarded to radio operator David Broadfoot.
Jack Hunter again.
Well, the messages were the crucial, the umbilical link, if you like. He was operating with Morse code. He was operating with wireless telegraphy, describing the ship's, what was thought to be the ship's position. He was describing the growing danger that the ship was in. He was talking about the amount of water that was probably on the ship. The messages he sends give a very graphic picture of the last hours of the Princess Victoria.
Half an hour after the first message from the Princess Victoria, the Jeannie Spears lifeboat in Portpatrick was launched. Other ships tried to come to the ferry's aid. On shore, it wasn't just the emergency services who were beginning to realise that the Princess Victoria was in trouble. Desmond McGimsey was a young reporter in Belfast.
We always used to congregate round about lunchtime in a pub off Donegal Street called the Duke of York, and we'd heard that there was a problem with the Princess Victoria, and we heard that the Donegal lifeboat had been called out. We immediately rang our editors to say that we were heading for Donegal because that was obviously going to be the rescue point.
In Glasgow, the captain's son, Jim, was returning home from a football match.
We could hear news vendors crying out that there was a ferry in difficulty, and I never thought anything about it at all. It was only when the gentleman in front of me in the queue bought a paper and was looking at the headlines that I looked over his shoulder and saw it, and I nearly fainted.
In Castle Rock, 3 young sisters whose mother, missionary Nancy Bryson, was on board the ship, waited.
I just remember sitting around the radio. I was 14, but I don't think even I was aware that this might be an absolute catastrophe. We just thought a rough sea and a ferry, well, it wasn't until I think much later in the day that we realised, or that had come across the radio, that, the ship had basically gone down and there were relatively few survivors.
Jim Blair's family in Larne knew his ship was in trouble. His daughter Anne Moore recalled waiting down at the shore with another girl, whose father was also crew.
And I remember her saying to me, Anne, can your daddy swim? And I said, no, my daddy can't swim. And she says, my daddy will be all right because my daddy can swim.
On board ship, the crisis begun by the breaching of the stern doors and the waves swamping the car deck now saw the stricken vessel slowly drifting towards the Irish coast and the Copeland Islands. Billy McAllister again.
We knew when she started listing, she started going over to one side line, weren't going to go very far, weren't going to go far at all. And then it wouldn't be a matter of time before the engines conked out on her if the water was getting in, And she lay like that for a long time.
At this point, passengers and crew were told to stand by and prepare to abandon ship. Those who could made their way outside. John Stanford again.
The only way we could get out was through a window. And we, the passengers, smashed a window on the port side, forward of that lounge, by walking around the seats, the bench-type seats which were around the bulkhead. And we used the brass instantaneous connection on a hose in order to smash that window. And I took off my greatcoat in order to put it over the jagged edge, because first several men got out and then stood outside and helped the rest of the passengers come out through the window because there was quite a severe drop.
But for others, there could be no escape.
Some of the passengers refused to go. There was one, dear old lady, absolutely refused. She said, no, I'm not going anywhere.
Nobody could help her because the ship was lying that much to one side. It was listed right to one side. And that's one thing that sticks out in my mind very, very much. An old lady, she went sliding right down the floor, and bashed into the side.
Passenger Billy Baird again.
About 1 o'clock, somewhere around about 1 o'clock, when we were ordered out. Then I noticed many more people, and I had quite a time to find a place to stand. And I was standing on the rails just opposite the bridge. I could look up and you could see the captain above you.
60 years on, Billy McAllister recalls his friend and colleague Jackie Hooper helping him that night.
He was in the pantry down below and I was in the galley in the top deck. And we run about together. You see in Larne, we used to go run about together and everything. It was him who got me the job. I was told to get up onto the deck, you know, get out. So I was sitting just outside the galley door and he was up in the rails. He says to me, "Give me your hand, I'll pull you up," he says. "Sit here, you may have a better chance if something happens." And that's what he says, "Give me your hand, I'll pull you up here," he says, "because sit up here with me." And we were sitting up there a long time, you know, it was freezing. And she started moving down. Started going over gradually, and then she went right over. I looked around, he was gone. Never seen him again.
John McKnight.
An old gentleman who was with me helped me up over the rail, and I got him up over the rail. But he was nearly 70 and he disappeared.
Back in Donegal, anxious friends and relatives watched as the lifeboat men battled the storm to try and reach survivors. Desmond McGimpsey.
It was a bright moonlight night, but the storm was as fierce as ever. The boat faced these breakers to get out of the narrow entrance of the harbour as it headed for the Copeland Islands again. You could see it on the top of the breakers and then disappeared into the troughs, and then it would reappear again on another breaker, and people were watching this transfixed, and they realised what a tremendous feat it was.
When the passengers and crew abandoned the Princess Victoria, some were able to reach the ship's lifeboats, and others clung desperately to small wooden rafts. Steamers, trawlers and a naval boat were searching for them, but the Sir Samuel Kelly lifeboat from Donegal was the first to pluck a large group of survivors to safety.
So the coxswain drew up. The first go, he took off 28 of them, I think. We got them all aboard, only one anyway. We got them all aboard and got them settled down, and there's one fella aboard there still. He was a bit anxious right enough, but we shouted at him to keep quiet. We're coming back down again. The coxswain come down alongside him again, picked him up and shoved the boat off. Happened to see a raft, and we didn't seen something lying on the raft, so I went away across to it and had a look at it, and it happened to be a man was lying on the raft. Holding on all he could hold, picked him up, put him aboard.
44 men were picked up over the course of the next few hours, but later it became apparent that what had been a rescue operation was now a search for bodies.
Trawler lying off Blackhead, and she had 2 survivors aboard her, and I don't know whether it was 4 or 6 women dead. So I picked them up. The next morning at 7 o'clock, I think we left, and we scourged the whole channel. We seen a youngster, a lifeboat, picked him up. Well, things was a bit sad at the time, seeing this. And they looked again on the seas, a boat away outside, and he told us there was bodies floating around him, so we started to go, and we got 2 around him, and then we started to got signals from here, signals from there, to pick this one up, pick that one up.
By the next day, the survivors' stories were beginning to be heard.
There were survivors all around in the water and clinging to pieces of wreckage and on rafts and one thing and another.
I saw 2 women making for the lofts, and there was one wee kiddie with them. And there was people round about us in the water, and we were trying our very best to get them out, and we succeeded in getting some out.
Sadly, not one woman or child survived the sinking of the Princess Victoria.
I ran the full length of the keel. I made a jump and I landed into the lifeboat. Now there was women and children in that lifeboat. When the ship turned turtle, there was nothing in the lifeboat that was lashed. Everything was thrown out. They hadn't an oar, they had nothing. And that boat was coming in the hull. And I said, "Look out, boys." And the next thing, she crashed that into the hull. Boat just flew in the air, spilled everybody out.
Both John McKnight and Billy McAllister believe that only pure chance allowed them to escape with their lives.
I feel that I was really lucky. Somebody was helping me to get to safety.
I can't swim, it wasn't by skill or anything, it was just luck you get off, you know.
Lord Brookborough, Northern Ireland's Prime Minister, announced the tragic news on the radio.
The wreck of a fine vessel is tragic enough. How much worse is the loss of precious lives?
Jack Peoples from Larne was just 16 in 1953. He was the youngest crew member to die. His sister is Betty Crawford.
He just wanted to go to sea, and although Mum wasn't keen on it, that was his wish. He just had about a year and a half at sea, and that was it.
Some of those who drowned were never found. For Jack's family, having his body brought home was hugely important.
Mum disappeared and I couldn't find her, and I went out the back and there she was standing just praying to God, God, just please bring me back his body. I feel now that God answered her prayer and we're all able to say goodbye to him. I remember my younger brother Joe just wouldn't go to the coffin, but I went and kissed him goodbye.
In Stranraer, the family of Captain Ferguson were also trying to cope with their loss.
The uncles and aunties that lived in Stranraer rallied round, came round to the house. One of the things I do remember was one of the first people to come to the door was from the Salvation Army, that always rally round on occasions like that. We had a few of the sailors who survived came to the door within the next few days to speak to my mother. My mother appreciated that very much, that in times of difficulty and stress upon themselves, they could find the time to come.
That happened 60 years ago, but you feel that loss still very much?
Very much so. I love my father.
In the aftermath of the disaster, the bravery of all of the crew of the Princess Victoria, as well as those who tried so hard to rescue people, was publicly acknowledged.
Captain Ferguson gave orders from the bridge practically up until the ship sank. David Broadfoot was in his radio cabin, and as the ship was turning over, if he'd opened the door to try and escape, all he would have seen would have been the sea beneath him. He stayed in his cabin broadcasting continuously. He even at one stage apologised to the other radio stations that were listening in for the quality of his Morse code.
As well as David Broadfoot's George Cross, bravery medals were awarded to many of those involved in the rescue, including the British Empire Medal, presented to Hugh Nelson, the coxswain of the Sir Samuel Kelly. Passengers also showed fortitude in the worst of circumstances. Nancy Bryson from Castle Rock was called the heroine of the Princess Victoria. She worked as a missionary in Kenya with her husband Edgar. Her eldest daughter Margaret Njonjo has spoken for the first time about the tragedy, and in particular how it affected her father.
They were a very, very close couple. Each relied on the other. He was absolutely distraught. He was really, really devastated. And it was very difficult for him to show his emotions. I think he tried to protect us from, the depths of his despair and grief.
A court of inquiry into the disaster was convened in Belfast 2 months later. Its verdict that the Princess Victoria was unseaworthy. For those who survived the events of that terrible night, and for the relatives of those who died, like Captain Ferguson's son, time has not erased their sorrow.
And on the 60th anniversary this year, where will you be?
A memorial service down at Agnew Park, where the memorial is, and then half an hour later there's a service up at the High Kirk. And then I always go out and leave a posy myself and put flowers in the church. Never forget. Never forget.